Well, hello, everybody. Tara Bachland here, health and wellness entrepreneur and into many modalities of health and healing. And I have the pleasure today of being with Sean Pedrig O'Donoghue. I hope I said that all right. And I've worked with him in various capacities, but primarily through the Matthew Wood Institute of Herbalism. Have been absolutely blown away by his insights and classes at the Matthew Wood Institute of Herbalism, and I'm sure you will be too. Today, we're continuing on the series of becoming an herbalist. And Sean is not only an herbalist, but also a beautiful poet. And you'll see it certainly visiting his website, which he'll share with you, and his writings there. So it's a beautiful combination. And so I'm so glad that Sean will be sharing a bit of his history and path to becoming an herbalist with us. Hello, Sean.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for all the work you're doing to connect people with the plants in so many ways.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's tonight's not about my story, but I never really saw myself on this path per se directly. And with this series, I'd like to help people, I assume, that are kind of like me in that way. And I hear a number of people that you don't really always see your path, right? You just kind of
Right.
follow one step at a time and kind of follow your heart and where the forces push you sometimes, and that whether it's herbalism or wherever you get called to be in life, that keep following those. I've heard them called niggles in life, just those little messages.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Stephen Buhner always called it following the golden thread. And
Mm.
he said when you don't know where to go, where to turn, let your awareness come into your heart and then begin to notice what in the world is luminous in a different way than anything else, and keep following that quality of luminosity. And since I first heard him say that many years ago, that's been a guiding principle for me.
That's really beautiful. I think it comes across as visual, but I kind of got a sense like of warmth also.
Yes, yes, it can come through any of your senses, really. I think English is a language that lends itself most to the visual sense. So we have the word luminosity to speak of that kind of glow, but absolutely that warm feeling, that sense of a scent on the wind, whatever that scent of that sense of the distant music you hear underneath the sound of the wind, whatever sense it is that it speaks to you through, there will be a way in which something speaks to your senses and calls you on a path that might not seem to make sense at first, but which, if you are faithful to, will continue to carry you into more and more coherence and more aliveness.
What would you say were some of those early golden threads for you, calling you to herbalism and herbal practice?
Well, it all came on quite suddenly for me. My first career was in human rights work and activism and in journalism. And I had grown deeply heartbroken and deeply frustrated trying the same things over and over again, and seeing that, yes, there would be a little bit that might happen to mitigate some people's suffering for a short time, but none of it felt as transformational, as meaningful as I felt like it needed to be. And so it was actually right around this time of year that I went to Oaxaca in southern Mexico in the wake of an uprising. And while I was there, the entire state was under occupation by military police. And we were meeting with people who were in hiding, telling their stories. And then we finally got up to the hills to one of the few towns that the police hadn't taken over. And meeting people there, I heard them talking about how they felt such loss because so many people had left their community. And they also were dealing with the fact that they were the people who had grown corn for the longest time of anyone in the world. And that genetically modified corn had made its way into their community and was threatening their traditional crops. But they said that the elders were able to go out and walk among the plants and recognize which plants belonged and which plants didn't. And my rational talking mind said, oh, that's a beautiful story. I wish that were true. And something deeper in me knew that that was true, and that the truth underlying that truth of the world being alive was precisely what was missing from my life and my culture. And so I flew back from that with my heart broken wide open. And I'm normally a pretty introverted person, but for some reason I thought it was a good idea to go to a dinner party in Boston the night I got off the plane.
Oh, wow.
And I was feeling even more out of place there than I normally would have been. But there was one person, one woman, who seemed to have a very different presence to her than anyone else there. And I noticed that she was wearing a crescent moon necklace around her neck. And when we finally ended up speaking, I asked her about the necklace, and she told me that had been given to her by her teacher, Rosemary Badstar, and that she was an herbalist. And she began speaking about listening to the plants and began speaking about working with plants to help women reconnect with sovereignty of their own bodies. It was just so beautiful and so profound to me, and I was really, really struck by it. And then I went back to Maine, where I was living then as I'm living now, although I've wandered other places in between. And with all the grief that I had taken on, I very quickly developed bronchitis, which soon became pneumonia. And I was really, really in rough shape. And I also, at that point in my life, had completely disregarded my physical health because I had thought it was a lost cause. And that New Year's Eve, that herbalist had looked up my phone number in the phone book for Bangor, Maine, back when we still had phone books. This was right at that crossover period when we had the internet but still had phone books. And she called me out of the blue, and we talked for a while, and then we hung up, and then she called back immediately, and she said, I heard the way you were breathing, and there's a plant who can help you. And her name is Elecampane, and she has a bright yellow flower and a deep resinous root. And she helps to pull up everything that you hold on to in your lungs. And that day I went to the health food store in town and got my first ounce of Elecampane tincture. As I took the very first drops, not only did I feel my breathing change in a way that pharmacology couldn't explain happening that quickly, but I felt the whole story that my body was broken and there was nothing I could do about it began to unravel. And that was a path to giving me back my breath, to helping me find my way to movement and towards changing how I ate and changing how I lived, and really the beginning of a great transformation in my life. And that herbalist, Misha Schuler, is still a friend of mine whose work I greatly admire.
That's amazing. Would one be able to summarize that change as maybe hope? A
Yes,
sense of hope?
yes,
Isn't that fascinating that I'm continually amazed how herbs not only help with the physical realm, but they can help with the emotional, psychospiritual realms as well. And then, but they go together.
absolutely. Yeah, they're one and the same. There's an interesting thing with hope, that the word in Irish for hope is dochas, and And it rhymes with this other word in Irish, duchas,
Mm.
which means tradition, but it also means instinct, and it also means connection to the land. And
Mm.
so it's when you root back into that inheritance, that tradition, that instinct, that tie back to the land, that you begin to be able to come back into the flow of hope.
Yes. Oh, that's so I love language connections like that, 'cause it's connected the language, of course, is connected to so many things as well. That's fascinating. I just already forgot some questions. Starting down that path. Um, what if I may go back for a moment, however, you were mentioning that through your previous work that you were seeing or experiencing that what you were doing, or maybe as a group collectively trying to help, was not working. What were some of those modalities, and what was you inferred it or basically said it, but what was missing?
So I tried everything, ranging from meeting with members of Congress to going around and giving talks in church basements to going to war zones to document what was happening to people directly to organizing demonstrations to going to jail for blocking the entrances to weapons plants. And what was missing to me fundamentally, I think, was the cultural change and the deep change in perspective that I think are required for us to be able to actually live in a different way. And most people throughout most of history have deeply known that the world is alive and deeply known that the plants and the animals and the fungi are our kin. And I knew that at that point intellectually, but I didn't really have that experience viscerally until the plants began to speak to me more directly. First, um, when I took those first few drops of helicampane, and then next when several months later I was in a period of having everything in my life fall apart at the same time. The job I had been working in was going away because we lost funding for it. So I was losing the place where I lived as well. I was going through a breakup. I was going through a crisis of faith. And so I went to the woods and I prayed to get lost.
Hmm.
And walking through the woods, I followed everywhere that the usnea lichen had fallen on the ground. Until finally, even though I was on really familiar paths, I was lost indeed. And as soon as I was lost, I closed my eyes and I felt like the usnea was working its ways into the cracks in my heart and telling me that I didn't need to depend on anyone else to mediate between the plants and me, that this communication and connection was our birthright. And that revelation was coming to me just at the same time that I was first finding Matthew's writing and first finding Stephen Buhner's writing. Otherwise, I might very well have checked myself into an institution at that point. But instead, I came to understand that no, this was something that was really happening, and that this actually was something that happened for most people in most of the world for most of history.
Mhm.
And that without that experience, we can't really step outside the frameworks that we've known. And the frameworks that we've known keep bringing the same results that they've continually brought.
It's so interesting. What comes to mind is your world was already coming apart, and and like you're mentioning, in other cultures or more traditional cultures, they would deliberately go on a walkabout or do some kind of journey where they deliberately go out in the wilderness. And it's like a part of you, going back to the threads, Stephen Buhner's following the golden threads, some part of you, it seems, I'm interpreting, knew it had to block out everything and
Right.
symbolically follow in trust, doing it physically, doing it in real life, to then be able to feel it inside.
Yes. And there's a tricky bit here that I think people tend to miss. So, like in our larger culture, there tends to be the idea that we always need to be holding things together, and that
Mm,
if we come apart, that's wrong and that's disastrous. And really, if we look at every other culture throughout history, those moments of deep change when everything does seem to be coming apart are the moments when it actually becomes possible to open into something else. On the other hand, I think that well-intentioned people have taken things too far in the other direction, trying to correct that by saying that our pain and our suffering is the goal, and identifying with the pain and the suffering. It's like,
mhm,
no, it's a gateway.
mhm,
And you don't stand in the doorway, you need to pass through. And it's difficult, and not everybody has the same level of support and resources in doing it.
mhm,
But I do feel like once that deep intention is made, once that willingness to say, okay, I'm going to open myself to how life wants to move, I'm going to open myself to something beyond my understanding, that a whole lot of help from a whole lot of surprising directions tends to find its way to begin cutting in.
I'm glad you pointed out made those points. That there's a I wouldn't say a happy medium, because sometimes we need to go back and forth. It's about flow
Right.
and flexibility, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So did you come from a background, like were your parents into herbs and maybe, other modalities, or what kind were you kind of set up in a way to be open to these things, or was this way out of your realm?
Some of both. So, on the surface, like my parents have always followed very much the path of conventional medicine, and that was the one path that I knew. And we also sort of had this family sense that we were dealt a bad genetic hand, and that bad health was just what we dealt with. On the other hand, there were those hidden pieces. So I think about with my mom, she grew up in upstate New York, spending time out in the forest with wildflowers, and had and has a deep love of plants that's been with her her whole life. And she also both introduced me directly to poetry and had books of poetry on the shelf that I would pull down and spend time with, that began to be my opening to another way of understanding the world differently.
Mm.
And with my dad, um, Irish Catholic is different than other kinds of Catholic in a lot of ways. Well, I think there are many ways in which Catholicism in different cultures has found ways to weave together with bits of older tradition. But in particular with him, all my life, he's always been someone who's visited people in the hospital and brought holy water from the shrine of Our Lady of Knock in County Mayo to bless people. And I didn't really understand that. It didn't really relate to that until I went to Ireland and went to the Holy Wells and understood that these places where wild water comes up out of the earth have always been the sacred places, and whatever language we give to them, whatever names we call the sacred, is the same kind of blessing. And that in many ways, as the person who brought holy water to the hospital for people, and still does, my father also prepared me in indirect ways for this path.
Now, I would say too, similarly, I was raised Catholic, and it instilled somehow the sense of the mystic. It really opened up that realm, and only looking back could I really see that. And I've wondered more recently, I was kind of wondering if you would go down this path because I kind of wanted to ask this question, whether how, of course, Catholicism being a part of the Christian sect, that the Irish in particular are still very much, as far as I know, you hear it all over the place, like the little people and all the magic and the wells. I don't know if they particularly say magic, but very open, can hold both concepts, both beliefs at the same time. That these and I'm trying to, I feel like I'm not quite using the right terms, but that both realms can exist.
Right.
And I don't really have, if I feel if I ask a direct question, I'm going to like pigeonhole it. Do you want to riff on that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So belief is a funny word. It's something that we focus on a lot in this culture.
Mhm.
And it also like hasn't necessarily been the most important question throughout history. And I think the fantasy novelist Terry Pratchett has a character, Granny Weatherwax, who speaks of that quite wonderfully. She says she's a witch, and she says witches don't believe in gods. They interact with them far too often for that. It would be rather like believing in the postman. And there's an element of that in especially rural culture in the west of Ireland, and especially in the Gaeltacht, the Irish-speaking regions, um, where the sense of walking through places of power and feeling their blessing, the sense of feeling something outside of ordinary reality that's present around you all the time, but sometimes in very intense ways, is just a part of lived experience. And often, if you asked people if they believed in the other world, if they believed in the Dinashi, the fairy people, they might say no. But at the same time, um, in another context, they might tell you the story of what happened to them or to their grandmother or to their cousin. And they will adhere to practices that honor old ways, just through the way of living. And there are still areas of Ireland where you can't get someone to cut a lone hawthorn standing atop a hill, because everybody knows that that is a great offense to the other world, and it's not worth taking the risk, whether you admit to believing in it or not. So there's that reality. There's also the great degree to which the kind of folk Catholicism of the culture is one in which the wells that used to be sacred to a goddess of the land became sacred to a saint. And
Mm.
that saint took on some of the same qualities as that old spirit, and sometimes even the same name. And so the question of is it Christian or is it pagan would be very significant and very important within this culture, but is kind of not entirely relevant in that framework.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've wondered that myself, in the sense of looking with different eyes on Catholicism. I'm personally not really super critical. I just find it fascinating, how these concepts can marry. And it sounds like you were saying, it's about the word. A big portion of it is about definition of belief.
Right.
And what comes to my mind is, in a number of languages there are two verbs for to know. And you might know a person is a different kind of knowing, or you might know a subject. And so there's one is more of a familiarity, like, are you familiar with, do you know Sean? I don't know you through and through, but I'm familiar with you. And the other is to know, like how you might know a subject, or I know, my husband's in the living room, that kind of thing. And
Right.
that's why another thing that I find fascinating about language is you can get these nuances of understanding as well.
Absolutely.
Well, we could go a lot further down that rabbit hole, but we'll keep journeying on. How about that?
Sounds good.
So once you had this experience with Elecampane, how did tell us about your path in education and herbalism?
It's all been following golden threads. Initially, it was spending lots and lots of time with books and lots of time wandering out in the fields and the forests. Then I tried briefly to go back to activist work in the city. Didn't go quite so well. And I tried to enroll in formal herb school then, but I was too advanced for the beginning course, and the intermediate course was canceled. And so I got invited to sit in on a practitioner's circle and hear people talking about cases. And I began having the very first clients and the very first students come to me. And always I would turn them away several times and suggest somebody who I thought was better to help them. And then finally they would say, no, I want you to do this. And I would. Then I had another one of those. Whenever I try to fit my life into a pattern that's not really true to my spirit, it always comes apart one way or another. And as that was coming apart, again, my attempt to go back to my old kind of work, and my attempt to find life in the city, a few opportunities opened up. And the first was some friends gave me money to go spend a weekend with Stephen Buhner and Julie McIntyre when they were teaching in Vermont, which deeply, deeply transformative. Another friend asked me to help out with first aid at some festivals he was organizing. And I kind of thought, oh, well, I might be giving some willow bark to somebody who has a headache, or putting some rose hydrosol on somebody's sunburn. And it actually turned out that I was the entire first aid team, and that at the time I was living out of the back of my pickup truck, which was a good thing because the tinctures that filled most of the back of my truck were the medicine available. And so over the course of that summer, I got thrown into the clinical deep end, being the only care on hand at these festivals, though I recruited a few other herbalists after the first one. And then shortly after that, I was invited to a weekend with Margie Flint, from whom I learned so much about being with people and reading people on so many levels and connecting people with plants. And she was also the one who introduced me to Matthew, whose work I already knew and loved. And before long, herbalism was what I was doing.
That's some of the best education. I mean, it can feel so intimidating, but if you just dive right in, whatever it is, you'll learn
Yeah.
so much.
And I find that herbalists are so generous. I think about Matthew and Stephen and Margie and Kiva Rose and Jim McDonald and all these other people who I got to know very early on, and who were always happy to answer my questions and happy to have conversations with me. And so I managed to get a thorough education without getting a formal education. And then eventually I found I was working mostly in a purely energetic way. And I began finding that the things that people were saying about the science and chemistry of herbalism didn't sound quite right to me, but I didn't really know enough to refute them or to challenge them. And so I realized that I needed to teach myself phytochemistry and delved into that. And the work of Lisa Ganora and of Kenneth Perfrock were very influential on me in coming to that understanding. But ultimately, I found that the science is important, and the science doesn't actually contradict the
Mm.
intuitive and the energetic. You just need to be able to speak both fluently to make them work together.
That class that you and Matthew did on the pharmacology of plants is super fascinating. And as you said that you uh, originally were working in the realm of energetics, how you beautifully correlated the energetics and pharmacology is super fascinating.
I loved working with Matthew on that class so much. It's always such an honor to work with him. Such a pleasure. But that class in particular, it felt so good to be doing that. And I also find that when you're working from more than one direction at the same time, it keeps you honest. Because if you're going too far astray in one direction or another, it won't work when you try to translate it. And the problem in translation will make you have to look at the whole question all over again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. On a similar but different note, you know, herbalism has been taught for eons at, person side by side with one person and another. And I think fortunately, in a sense, in the US at least, it hasn't been regulated. I mean, you can be a registered herbalist through a number of organizations, but it hasn't been highly regulated. So there's a lot of freedom in how to learn and how to practice. And I would imagine that if you're not just diving right in, and the ER crew at these events, one could go years thinking, do I know enough? Can I put myself out there? And what would you say to someone in that situation if they're like, oh, I don't know if I'm ready to, start doing consultations?
Well, to begin with, having that humility is a good sign. And stay with and don't hide that humility. Recognize that you know what you know. And if somebody's dealing with something that you feel like you have an understanding of, and you can have a conversation with them about your understanding of their situation and your understanding of the plants, and they make a choice based on that to go connect with the plants that you recommend, that's a beautiful thing. But there's also nothing wrong with saying, this is more complicated than I'm ready for. Might I suggest somebody else? Or, I don't know. Let me talk with a few other herbalists and look at a few books and come back to you. There are still all kinds of situations with clients where I say, I think I have a grasp of this, but I need to be sure. Let me get back to you. And I don't know, let me get back to you is always an acceptable answer.
Mhm.
And if it's not, then the person's not the right client for you, and you're not the right herbalist for them.
So true, and it's so wise too. I mean, I would want a practitioner if they're stumped, not to just guess, but to consult, and that's how we learn, right?
Right.
We don't go through it knowing it all. We're actually working on in the next couple months, we'll be implementing at the institute, which I'm sure will be happy to see, and we'd hope you to participate as well. Is an advanced discussion group.
Oh,
So where people they may be likely will be practitioners can come together and discuss cases, and then we'll actually have those who are not advanced students or practitioners can observe, and they can listen in on the conversation and make it part of their lessons as well. So we're working on a bunch of uh, kind of connecting points. How can we connect with each other and help each other along? So yeah, with the benefit of technology these days.
right. Wonderful.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Oh, the other question just went right out of my brain. So my next question would be, like, when did you decide to make herbalism a profession? But it seems like it kind of met you, like you've had these
Right.
synchronistic points. Maybe coinciding with that would be, especially new practitioners are like, how do I find clients, or how do they find me? What have been some ways that have been really helpful for you in making it a profession?
I've never, every time I've tried to follow business advice, it hasn't worked particularly well for me. But every time I've just put myself out there writing and teaching about what calls to me, um, I find that it reaches the right audience. And that through those people who read what I write and those people who hear me speak, it ripples out. And some of them will come to me as clients. Some of them will send somebody in their life to me as a client. And then it ripples out from there further. So I think just showing up authentically, and you don't need everybody to be your client. And in fact, you don't want everybody to be your client. And the people who are best suited to you will gravitate toward you if you put yourself authentically out there.
So where can people find or some of your writings, or how do they find you through writings, or where have you been speaking that people tend to find you?
I'm sorry, you were a bit garbled there from my
Oh.
end, or maybe I was garbled. Somebody was garbled.
Where do you write so that people can find you, and where do you speak where people find you?
uh, I I write for Plant Healer Quarterly, and I also have a Substack newsletter that is sometimes herbalism, sometimes poetry, sometimes myth. And really, to me, they're all kind of woven together. And in the same way, I teach weekly classes that weave together those worlds on Sunday nights, online, through my Other World Well hedge school, which you can find through my website, otherworldwell.com. And I also have taught several courses with the Matthew Wood Institute and hope to teach more in the future. And I also every year take part in the Good Medicine Confluence, which will be in Durango, Colorado this July.
You have I haven't had a consultation with you, but just hearing your teaching and being in many sessions, recording classes and so forth, you have a very unique style, and I think that's important what you said. Not every client is for you. You're not for every client, and that's I think what's important about putting yourself out there is so that people can go, oh yeah, that's someone that we can see eye to eye, or like you just kind of have a connection in a way. How would you describe your let's say style of herbalism?
It varies so much from person to person. Um, it really is about meeting the person where they are and trying to speak a common language. There are people who come to me who are working very much in a biomedical framework, and I feel like I have enough fluency in that to understand what they're saying and speak to them in a way that makes sense. There are people who come to me more from a standpoint of wanting to work with spirit or work with their ancestors, and I meet them there. Um, there are clients who would swear that I was a Catholic seminarian because I can translate back into a different theological language. It really is about if I can meet the person authentically where they are, and we can have that conversation about how they understand what they're experiencing, and I can bring something that makes sense within that framework, then healing can happen. And along with that is that the plants are always guiding what I'm doing. And what I'm doing in working with the plants always has to be in the best interests of the plants and the ecosystems that they're part of. I don't view herbs as just like greener pharmaceuticals to give to somebody. I understand them as living beings who are offering themselves. So I'm always listening deeply, and there's always a strong intuitive element to which I'm feeling where is the shift that's needed in this person's body or in this person's life, and what is the plant that moves in that direction, and asking, does that plant want to help? And with some people, it can be that direct conversation about the conversation with the plants. With other people, I will explain it more in terms of the science behind why the plant moves things in that direction. Again, it's meeting people where they are. Um, and they become a check on each other. I always make sure that what I'm intuitively led to makes sense with what I know of of the actual physiological medicine of the plant, and vice versa. I make sure that there can be the plant that would seem to make the most logical sense, but can just not be right. And every time I override that intuition, it never does harm, but it never helps quite as much. But every time I listen to that intuition, I always find out that there's some further layer, either to the medicine or to the situation, that I wasn't fully consciously aware of, that my intuition was giving me a signal about.
Well, I imagine maybe even the client might not be aware. I think of a time several months ago for myself, and some herbalists say you shouldn't self-prescribe herbs, but I do.
All kinds of shoulds and couldn'ts in this world,
Um,
and
yeah,
exceptions to everyone.
yes. And so I was self-prescribing. I'm like, this one would be good, this one would be good. And I was in that state of like just the mental state, not really tuning in, because especially when you're kind of in crisis mode, that's probably a good indication to have someone else help you. And I was kind of in that kind of a chronic mode. And I one day I looked at him like, I have like 9 herbs lined up here. And it occurred to me, I think it was finally the herbs getting through on another level, saying, girl, there are some things that you need to do here. We can do a lot, but it's not just about taking more herbs because you think it's going to help. And
Right.
it's so fascinating how that sort of thing happens.
Really is, yeah.
So along those lines, what have you seen, or what do you think are some common misconceptions people have about herbs or herbalism?
On the one hand, I feel like I hear a lot of people who think that herbs are fine for mild situations, but that if something is more intense, then you have to treat it seriously. And
Mm,
I would say that I'm always treating things seriously when I'm bringing people and plants together, and that there are situations where I've seen herbs help to bring profound changes that nothing else could. The other side of that coin is I think there are all kinds of people who feel like they have to choose between, are they going to work with herbs or are they going to work with conventional medicine? Um, and absolutely, you have to be careful and you have to make sure everybody involved in your care team knows what everybody else is doing. But absolutely, you can work from multiple directions at the same time. And when I was starting out, I was a little bit of a fundamentalist until I reached the point when I couldn't cut off my own skin cancer, so I needed to go to a surgeon, and
mm,
that made me start to think about, okay, wait a second. Um, there are reasons and virtues for all kinds of approaches, and that it's far better if we can bring in the best of every approach. And so I feel like that's where some of the greatest popular misunderstandings lie, in those two directions, either that herbs are too weak, or that in order to engage herbs, you have to give up everything else.
mm. Yeah, we have so much at our fingertips, so to speak, these days. It seems silly to limit ourselves at the same time.
Right. Well, I often talk with people who will say, well, somebody practicing Chinese medicine thousands of years ago wouldn't have used an X-ray machine. It's like, well, they didn't have an X-ray machine. I don't think the Yellow Emperor would have said no to an X-ray machine, but he also would have still done his pulse diagnosis.
Yeah, very true. Do you see are there certain cases where the two have worked really well in tandem, where it's good to have, in your experience, where it's really good to have both modalities?
Yes, and I would say this is a broad generality, um, but in general, I find that conventional medicine is very good at stabilizing situations, and herbalism is very good at changing and shifting chronic patterns. And so, the majority of people I work with are dealing with something chronic in one way or another. And very often they've gotten to a point where things are sufficiently out of whack for them in one way or another that they do benefit from conventional medicine's assistance in getting them stable enough that we can work on the deeper layers, and then bring in herbs working at the deeper layers helps to bring more resolution. And there are many reasons why I love what I learned from Matthew about working with drop doses. Um, One being that they work so profoundly at those levels of the deep pattern of somebody's being and helping to reset it. But another is that there are still some places where you have to be careful about herb-drug interactions, but you can give drop doses to people at the same time that they are pursuing other treatments much more frequently than you can give people larger doses while they're pursuing other treatments.
What would be some examples of conventional medicine stabilizing a condition?
So we could think, for example, about an aggressive cancer. Um, it's possible that herbs might make a shift, but they might not work quickly enough to make a profound enough shift to save somebody's life. And so surgery or radiation, or in some cases even chemotherapy, might be life-saving for that person and buy them the time to be able to address the deeper issues. Well, an herbalist is looking at multiple levels at, okay, what can we do to address the general inflammatory environment that's almost always associated with cancer? And what is the wound at the spirit level or at the emotional level this person is dealing with that creates more vulnerability to this disease? And how can we find a plant that can help them shift their way of being in such a way to reduce the chances that they'll ever have to go through this struggle again? And I will say that there are also some cases where neither work. There are some cases where we are all mortal, and where at some point we will all die of something, and nothing can be forestalled infinitely. But one of the approaches that I love was one that I learned from the British herbalist Peter Conway, who was inspired by Dr. Bach, who created the flower essences, to this perspective. And he said there's a difference between being cured and being healed. And the difference is you can die healed.
Yeah.
And so our work is really about bringing coherence and flow into a person's life so that they can meet whatever it is they need to meet as fully as possible.
Not too many people are comfortable with the topic of trauma and grief and emotions. And I know you are not one of those people, which I appreciate that, we need the spokespeople, so to speak. That's not the right term, but we need people like that. Would you come back and we'll take a deeper dive into the emotions and how herbs help with that? And can we even guess at what they're doing and healing trauma and so forth?
I would love to, yes. Thank
Yeah,
you.
that'd be wonderful. Thank you. So on a closing note, are there any stories that come to mind that just still leave you in awe about we'll say, the healing potential of herbs? And I say healing in quotes because, there's all the legal stuff, and then it's also, are they healed? Are we cured? Sort of thing. So I'm waving my hands, but I
Right.
feel we should be able to say healed, right? On some level. Do any amazing stories that just still leave you in awe come to mind?
Yes, many do, and I'm just sitting for a moment with which one wants to be told in this moment.
In the meantime, we're getting some nice thank yous. Thank you all very much for tuning in. Max said neat to your last comment. It's certainly our pleasure, for sure.
I think about being in a room full of people who are grieving, and knowing I was walking into a situation where I was going to be holding space for grief, and not really being sure how I was going to do that responsibly in a way that kept everything flowing rather than sinking in and settling in. And so I went for a walk, and there had been a windstorm the night before, and I was living out west at the time. And the windstorm had brought down all these boughs of red cedar. And so I gathered all these fresh windfall and red cedar boughs, and I brought them into the room, and I placed them around the corners of the room. And I dipped one of the boughs in seawater and sprinkled the room with it. And as soon as I did that, I felt an immediate sense in the way everything in the room felt, even before people entered. And then when people entered, it was much more a space in which grief was able to be spoken and to move through. And I think that that's one thing that we often forget, is that simply being in the presence of a plant can bring healing. Often we end up bringing the plants to people by bringing them a tincture, bringing them a tea, bringing them an oil. And those are all beautiful ways of bringing the medicine. But sometimes just the medicine of presence does it. St. Francis of Assisi used to tell people, preach the gospel, use words if you have to. And I often say, practice herbalism, give people herbs if you have to.
Yeah. Well, it's beautiful how it seems like things have come full circle. So how long ago was it that you were doing the activism work?
Oh, it was early 2000s, yeah.
Okay. So you've been practicing herbalism for 20 years-ish?
Not quite, but I think coming up on 15 or so.
Okay. So early on, so and activism in which realm specifically?
Mostly in opposing wars and arms sales, although I did work on environmental issues and on economic justice as well.
So going back to the quotes that you mentioned, do you feel that you're able to affect those realms without being in them more through herbalism?
It's really interesting because I was faced at the point that I left that realm behind. And I have to say that I still have many friends doing beautiful work in that realm, and I really, really honor them. It just wasn't the path that my being could continue.
Mhm.
I was out in the forest, and had been fasting for a few days and praying for vision. And once again, it was Usnia that began to speak to me, and it began saying, the wound is where the healing comes. It spoke of how the lichen grows on the tree in the places where the trees are damaged and produces the medicines that protect the tree. But it also, but I began saying, well, but how can I work with one person at a time when there's so much suffering in the world? How can I leave behind my work on this grander scale? And the answer that I got was every single person who I deal with, who I encounter, carries somewhere in their being the scars of those larger patterns of violence. And that if the wound is where the healing comes, in tending to those places, we find the alchemy of the medicine that can bring transformation. And I feel like that's absolutely true. And I've come to understand that the deepest part of that is the way that we are reawakening people to the life of the world. And that when people begin to experience the world as truly alive, they will no longer be willing to go along with the kinds of cruelty that they had accepted as inevitable before.
Inevitable or just part of day-to-day regular life.
Right.
Yeah, especially when you have the instance of having a healing experience from the herbs, you can't help but see the plants just outside your door as differently.
Exactly.
Our yard is full of flags. I mean, my husband was like this before, but we have all sorts of baby oaks starting to grow this year, and they probably were before, but the person mowing the lawn was my husband didn't get to them before the person mowing the lawn got to them, let's say. And we had learned through Matthew that when a tree or an oak in particular is about to die, or it is dying off, it'll send a bunch of acorns and try to repopulate itself apparently even more. And John had noticed that we had all these baby oak trees, and just we had flags everywhere in our yard too, so that they wouldn't get mowed over. But you can't help but you can't help but see, end up seeing the world so differently when you've just been helped by a seemingly innocuous baby innocent plant, and you realize, wow, there's so much more to this being.
Absolutely. And I have to say, now that you've mentioned oaks, that oaks have been, very old oaks have been some of my greatest teachers of how to walk in the world. And when you go and sit with a very old oak, there are things about presence that you learn that you can't learn in any other way. But by the same token, I always go to the very young oaks and tell them the things that I want other generations to know of this time, because those oaks that are so very young right now, some of them will still be alive, we hope, 1,000 years from now. And what we want to be remembered, they can carry for us.
That's pretty amazing. It is amazing to think and look around and especially see an old oak tree or these big majestic trees and think back, what have they seen? It's pretty incredible. Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. I look forward to continue our conversation. Thank you so much. Would you tell people once again where they can find your work?
Absolutely. My website is otherworldwell.com. And thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. I'll make sure to like, subscribe, leave comments if you have questions. We'll do our best to get to them, and even requests for the next interview, which should be always fun and insightful as it is. So have a wonderful night, everybody, or day, wherever you are. Take care. Bye-bye.